The blade was already at Vesper Gravesend's throat when Isadora Vale walked into the Grand Court of Nocturne. Not walked, strode. Chin raised, dark hair swept over one shoulder. The Vale family sigil, a silver key on black silk, pinned to the lapel of her jacket like a declaration of war. Every vampire lord and lady in that ancient chamber, draped in centuries of immortal pride and carved into their seats like statues of cold marble, turned to look at her, some with contempt, some with curiosity. Most with the particular brand of disdain that the old blood reserved for anything that breathed and aged and eventually died. She did not flinch. Vesper was kneeling at the center of the obsidian floor, which was the custom when a vampire heir faced a blood tribunal. His white hair was loose, falling forward over one cheek, and his pale hands were bound behind him with chains of consecrated silver. Another custom, cruel and ancient, meant to weaken the one being judged. Even kneeling, even chained, he looked like something carved from the architecture of the night itself. Broad shoulders, a jaw cut sharp enough to wound, eyes the color of deep winter water, pale and still and dangerously calm. The blade held against his throat belonged to Lord Casimir Drav, whose family had wanted the Gravesend seat for 400 years. "This mortal has no standing here," Casimir said without looking at Isadora. His voice was the sound of old ice cracking. "Remove her, the mortal," Isadora said, and her voice did not shake even slightly. "Has documentation." She held up a leather folio, its cover stamped with the seal of the Vale Covenant, one of the oldest human bloodlines in existence, a lineage whose written agreements with vampire courts predated the founding of most modern nations. The room shifted, not much, but enough. Vesper's eyes found hers across the chamber. Something moved in them. Something that was not the cold calculation she knew he had learned to show this court. Something private and fierce and unbearably honest. She had promised herself she would not look at him like that. Not here, not in front of them. She looked away first and addressed the tribunal. Under the 7th article of the Vale Gravesend Covenant, signed in 1743 and never dissolved, any binding judgment against the Gravesend heir requires the witnessed consent of the Vale Heiress of the current generation. I am that heiress, and I do not consent. The silence that followed was extraordinary. Lord Casimir, 400 years old and accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any room, slowly turned his head to look at her for the first time. It was not a comfortable experience, being looked at by Casimir Drav. His eyes were amber and ancient, and they held the memory of blood. But Isadora Vale had grown up reading the histories of every vampire court in existence. She had studied their weaknesses with the same attention she had given their strengths. She had known, since the age of 12, that the courts feared nothing so much as they feared their own laws. "You invoked the covenant," said the matriarch at the head of the tribunal, a vampire so old her skin had gone translucent at the temples, her white hair piled in architectural coils above a face of extraordinary severity. Her name was Elspeth Vale, and she had ruled the court of Nocturne for longer than most countries had existed. "I invoke it," Isadora confirmed. "I am Isadora Vale, 23 years of age, recognized heiress of the Vale line by the Vale Covenant's own succession charter, and I am standing here in person, which the 7th article requires. You cannot proceed." Elspeth's gaze moved from Isadora to Vesper and back again. It was the gaze of someone performing a very long, very cold calculation. "Release him," she said at last. The sound Casimir Drav made was not quite language, but he lowered the blade. Vesper rose. Even with his wrists still bound in silver, the movement had the quality of something predatory and unhurried. He turned those winter-water eyes on Isadora again, and this time she let herself hold the look because it didn't matter now whether the court saw. What mattered now was that he was standing, that the blade was not at his throat, that they had not taken him from her before she could. Before she could, what exactly? She had not entirely worked that out. She had driven 4 hours in the middle of the night with a folio of documents she had memorized at age 16, and had hoped never to need. She had walked into the most dangerous room in the known vampire world for a man who had once told her, 2 years ago, the first night they had spoken properly, instead of in the careful formal distances that their family's alliance required, that she was the most strategically formidable person he had ever met. He had not said it like a compliment. He had said it like a discovery that unsettled him deeply. She had found that more flattering than any compliment she had ever received. Isadora, his voice, low and careful, reached her across the chamber as the silver chains were unlocked by a court attendant with shaking hands. "You shouldn't have come." "Someone had to," she said. "Your court was about to execute you on a fabricated charge, and you sent me a message that said, and I quote, 'Don't come, it's handled.'" "It was not handled, Vesper," she heard. Beneath the vast stone ceiling and among the gathered ancient predators of the vampire world, the very faintest sound. It took her a moment to identify it. It was, she realized, the sound of several centuries-old immortals suppressing laughter. Casimir Drav did not look amused. He looked like a man who had just seen a perfectly designed trap spring closed and found himself on the wrong side of it. The night Isadora Vale had first truly met Vesper Gravesend, met him, rather than formally acknowledged him at the interminably dull inter-court diplomatic functions her father had dragged her to since she was old enough to dress herself appropriately, had been in a library, his library, technically. Or rather, the library of the Gravesend residence, a discreet Georgian townhouse in the middle of London that looked, from the outside, like the home of a very, very private and moderately wealthy family, and concealed, behind its perfectly ordinary black door, 6 floors of underground chambers that constituted the Gravesend Court's city residence. She had been 21. Her father, Lord Edmund Vale, had brought her to negotiate the renewal of the Vale Gravesend covenant's commercial terms, and she had found the negotiations breathtakingly tedious because her father's advisors kept deferring to the vampire representatives on points where the Vale family actually held the superior position. She had excused herself on the pretext of finding a restroom and had followed the smell of old books instead, which had led her through 2 unmarked doors and down a half-flight of stairs into a room 3 stories high, wall to wall, with volumes that ranged from recent academic text to manuscripts, so old they were housed in climate-controlled glass cases. She had been standing on a rolling library ladder, pulling out a 1642 history of vampire court succession laws when the lights had come on. "Those are organized," Vesper had said from the doorway. He was not looking at her with the remote, assessing quality he wore in formal settings. He was looking at her with something closer to genuine irritation. "There is a system. I can see the system," she had said, not coming down from the ladder. "Someone organized this chronologically within subject category, which is reasonably logical, but means you end up with primary sources and secondary sources intermixed, which is maddening if you're actually trying to research something." She had replaced the 1642 volume and pulled out the one beside it. "This cross-references better with the succession charter your family signed in 1698, which you have shelved in political documents, rather than with the legal histories. Have you ever actually tried to find something in here?" There had been a long silence. "You read historical vampire succession law," he had said at last. "For recreation. My father should have sent me into those negotiations instead of Gerald," she had said, meaning the lead Vale advisor. Gerald conceded 3 commercial points in the first hour that he had no business conceding. Your representatives walked away with significantly more than they should have. Another silence. She had come down from the ladder then, because holding a conversation at height with a vampire who was staring at her with that precise, unsettling attention had felt disadvantageous. "You're the Vale heiress," he had said. "Isadora," she had confirmed. "You're the Gravesend heir." "Vesper," he had said, and then, quietly, with that note she would come to recognize as the sound of him thinking faster than he was comfortable admitting. "You said Gerald conceded 3 points he shouldn't have." The Covenant's Commercial Annex, Section 4, Paragraph 9. The Vale family retains right of first review on any Gravesend territory expansion within metropolitan boundaries. Gerald agreed to redefine metropolitan boundaries in a way that excludes the southeastern corridor. That corridor has 3 Vale properties in it and will have 5 more when my father's current development plans complete. Vesper had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had said, "I'll have the annex redrafted before morning. I'd appreciate that," she had said. "Also, your library system is genuinely flawed. If you ever want to reorganize it by cross-reference rather than strict chronology, I have thoughts." He had not smiled. Vesper Gravesend did not smile easily or often, she would learn. But something had shifted in those pale eyes. Something that had looked, in retrospect, like the beginning of everything, the tribunal did not dismiss immediately after Elspeth Vale called for Vesper's release. Vampire courts did not operate on human timelines, and the matriarch had several centuries of political experience that had taught her to never let a moment of unexpected reversal simply evaporate without extracting what information she could from it. "You will remain," Elspeth said to Isadora, and it was not phrased as a request, "and you." Her gaze moved to Vesper, "Both of you." The court lords and slave filed back to their seats. A chair was brought for Isadora, which was noted by everyone present as a significant gesture. Chairs were not generally brought for guests of the tribunal. The tribunal's guests typically knelt. Vesper stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the particular cold that radiated from vampire skin, subtle and clean, like the air before snow. His silver-chained wrists had been freed, and he held them at his sides with careful stillness. The red marks the consecrated silver had left on his pale skin were already fading. That was one of the things about vampires. She had learned. They healed quickly, but they felt the damage entirely while it was happening. The silver had hurt him. He had simply refused to show it to the court. "The charge," Elspeth said, settling her ancient hands over the carved arms of her tribunal seat, was treason against the court. Specifically, the charge named Vesper Gravesend as having communicated sensitive court intelligence to a human interest group operating against vampire sovereignty. "That charge is fabricated," Vesper said. His voice was flat and factual, not defensive. "The evidence presented by Lord Casimir was a series of communications bearing your cipher." "My cipher was stolen," Vesper said. 6 weeks ago. I reported the theft to the court's Security Council." A murmur moved through the assembled lords. Casimir Drav was very still. "The Security Council," said one of the other tribunal members, a thin woman with the particular ageless quality of very old vampires, "has no record of such a report." "The report was submitted to the council's second-in-command," Vesper said. "A woman named Isolde Farr, who, I note, is not present today despite her position requiring her attendance at all tribunal proceedings." Isadora filed that name away with the particular efficiency she brought to all information she considered useful. Elspeth's gaze moved to an attendant at the room's edge, a silent gesture. The attendant left quickly. "In the meantime," Vesper continued, "I would suggest the tribunal examine the metadata on those communications. The cipher was stolen from my personal office. However, the communications were sent from a location I was not physically present at on any of the stated dates. I was, on each of those dates, in the company of a witness." He paused. "Isadora was with me." The room's temperature did not change, but the quality of its silence did. "The mortal heiress," Casimir said, and the word mortal in his mouth was a weapon, blunt and contemptuous, "is hardly a reliable witness in matters of court security." The Vale Covenant's 12th article. Isadora said, pulling the folio open to a page she had marked, "Grants Vale family testimony equal standing with vampire court testimony in any proceeding involving the Gravesend line. Written in 1743, never dissolved, never amended." You may find it on page 47 of the court's own covenant registry. She looked up. "I believe the court keeps that registry in the Eastern Archive. 3rd shelf, if I remember correctly from the last time I was permitted to review it." The thin woman on the tribunal was staring at Isadora with an expression that had moved past contempt into something that might, with significant qualification, be called respect. "You've memorized the Covenant Registry," she said. "I've memorized the relevant portions," Isadora said. "I've been the Vale Heiress since I was 19. It seemed like the kind of thing I should know." Vesper said nothing. But she was aware of him beside her, and she was aware. In the way she had become finely attuned to over 2 years of carefully calibrated proximity. That he was watching her with that specific quality of attention that he gave almost nothing else in the world. The tribunal took 3 hours to formally dismiss the charges. During those 3 hours, Isolde Farr was located in her private chambers in the court's residential wing, in the process of attempting to destroy a series of documents. The documents, recovered mostly intact, contained Casimir Drav's instructions to her in full. The communications bearing Vesper's stolen cipher had been sent from a location belonging to one of Casimir's subsidiary properties. A full audit of Casimir Drav's dealings revealed 4 separate violations of vampire blood law, the ancient codes governing conduct between vampire houses, and 1 violation of the intercourt treaty that governed relations with human covenant families. Casimir Drav was taken into the court's custody before the tribunal session ended. Vesper watched it happen from across the chamber with the expression of a man who has been waiting a very long time for something inevitable. He did not look triumphant. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion, a deeper kind of tired, the kind that came from 400 years of court politics and blood law, and being the heir to a legacy that was both a shield and a weight. Isadora saw that tiredness and recognized it, and said nothing about it, because that was not something for a tribunal chamber. The night air outside the Court of Nocturne's hidden entrance. The door was set in the lower level of a building that presented itself to the world as a private members' club in the financial district. Unremarkable, utterly anonymous, was cold and clean in the way of late October. Isadora's breath misted. Vesper's did not. He stood beside her on the empty street, jacket perfectly straight despite the events of the last several hours, his white hair caught by the wind off the Thames. "Your driver," he said, "is undoubtedly waiting on the north side of the building. You should go." "My driver can wait another 5 minutes," she said. A pause. "You memorized the Vale Covenant at age 16, he said. 16 for the broad outline. I didn't have the secondary articles fully down until 18. She turned to look at him. "You knew I had. You knew when you sent me that message, the one that said don't come, it's handled, that I would check it against what I knew about blood tribunal procedures and realize immediately that it was not in fact handled." Another pause. Longer. "You sent me that message on purpose," she said. "You knew I would come. You knew I would invoke the covenant. I knew you were the only person in existence with both the standing and the knowledge to do so," he said. His voice was careful. Vesper was always careful with his voice. "I did not want to put you in that room, but you needed me in that room. Yes, and you trusted me to handle it." He turned to look at her then, fully, and the London streetlights caught the pale planes of his face and the absolute directness of those winter water eyes. "I have trusted you to handle nearly everything of consequence in my life for the past 2 years, he said. "I was aware this might be placing an unreasonable weight on someone who has her own life and her own responsibilities." "It is not unreasonable," she said quietly. "It is the covenant." No, he said. "It is not the covenant. The covenant gave you standing. What you did tonight, driving 4 hours, walking into that chamber alone, invoking articles that most vampire lords have never bothered to memorize. That was not the covenant. That was you." The wind moved between them, carrying old city smell and the distant sounds of traffic. Isadora looked at the street, then back at him. "The court thinks it's a weakness," she said, "that you care about a mortal, that you communicate with me, that you trust me. I've heard it said." "I know what they think," he said. "Tonight changed some of that." "Yes," he said. "Tonight." A mortal heiress used 300 years of vampire blood law to save the vampire heir's life and dismantle the longest-standing political conspiracy in this court's recent history. The faintest edge of something moved through his voice. It took her a moment to identify it as Rye. "I believe the court's position on mortal devotion may require some revision." She laughed. It surprised her, because the laugh came up entirely without her permission. She heard it in the cold air, genuine and warm, and saw something happen in his expression that she had seen only a handful of times in 2 years. The careful architecture of his self-possession shifted just slightly, like a door opening an inch to let in light, and he looked at her with something unguarded and undefended, something that was not the Gravesend heir's polished control, but the person underneath it. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." "I don't feel the cold that much. I'm aware. I still dislike watching you stand in it." She held his gaze for a moment. "That is the most roundabout invitation I've ever received. I am 420 years old," he said. "I have not rushed anything in a very long time." 400 and, she stopped. "You never told me your actual age. You never asked directly. You asked how old the Gravesend line was." A pause. "I answered a different question. That," she said, "is enormously irritating." "Yes." He agreed and held the door open for her. The Gravesend London residence wrapped around her like a held breath when she stepped inside. That familiar combination of deep cold and extraordinary age. The smell of old leather and old stone and something else beneath it, clean and sharp and uniquely him. She had been here enough times that it no longer felt foreign. It felt, if she was being honest with herself, more like home than the Vale family's own Mayfair house, which had been tastefully renovated twice in the last decade, and now felt less like a family seat than a very expensive hotel. She dropped her coat on one of the hall chairs and set the folio on the entry table and stood for a moment with her hand on it, feeling the last 3 hours drain out of her body all at once. The adrenaline had kept her perfectly steady through the tribunal chamber. Now that the immediate danger had passed, her hands were shaking. She clasped them together so he wouldn't see. She felt him come to stand behind her, not touching. He never touched without clear invitation, but close enough that the cold radiating off him reached her, steady and familiar. "Isadora, I'm fine, your hands are shaking." She unclenched them. "They are not." A pause. They were. "I have very good eyesight." She turned around. He was closer than the formal distances of the library and the diplomatic functions and the careful catalogued months of their alliance. He looked at her with that absolute attention of his, and she could see, now that she was looking properly and not managing a crisis, that he did not look merely tired. He looked, beneath the control and the centuries of self-possession, something very close to shaken. "You stood in that chamber," he said very quietly, "and you said the words that stopped that blade. Do you understand what it cost me to watch that? To watch you walk into that room alone?" "I wasn't in danger," she said. "I had legal standing. They couldn't touch me without violating." Casimir Drav, Vesper said, "has violated blood law 4 times in the last 3 years. A man willing to violate blood law is not reliably deterred by covenant standing." His jaw tightened. "I knew the covenant would hold the tribunal. I was significantly less certain it would hold Casimir specifically." The fear in his voice was the most carefully controlled fear she had ever heard. It was barely there at all, but she heard it. "It held," she said gently. "It held," he agreed, "because you were precise and calm and formidably prepared and you gave him no opening, but you were also alone and unarmed in a room full of ancient predators, and for approximately 4 minutes, after you walked in, before Elspeth called for release, I was in chains and could do nothing. And I have spent the last 200 years ensuring there was never a situation in which I could do nothing. This was..." He stopped. His voice had gone tighter than usual. This was not a comfortable experience. Isadora looked at him for a long moment. "You are," she said carefully, describing the experience of being the person who needs protecting for once, rather than the person doing the protecting. Something moved in his face. The door opened another inch. "I am not accustomed to it," he said. "I noticed," she said. "You're also not very good at accepting help." "No, that message you sent me. The one that said don't come, it's handled. You sent it because you knew I would come, but you sent it so that if anything went wrong, if the covenant didn't hold or Casimir acted before the tribunal could be convened, I wouldn't be there. You sent it to give me an out." He didn't answer. "You were protecting me," she said, "by trying to keep me away from protecting you." "Yes," he said finally. "That is," she said, "the most Vesper Gravesend thing you have ever done." This time, something moved across his face that was unmistakably, undeniably the beginning of a smile. It did not fully arrive, but it was present, and it transformed his face into something she wanted to study for a very long time. "You have known me for 2 years," he said. "I have known you," she said, "and I mean known, not simply been diplomatically acquainted with, for about 18 months. Long enough to recognize that you would rather sustain significant personal injury than allow someone you." She paused for just a fraction of a second. "Someone you care about to take on risk on your behalf. And yet you came anyway." "And yet I came anyway," she confirmed. "Because I care about you considerably more than I care about your preference for bearing everything alone." The space between them had narrowed without either of them moving. Or perhaps they had both moved slightly, and the precise measurement of it had been lost in the conversation. She was looking up at him, and he was looking down at her, with that expression she had no word for, the one that was all the careful control stripped away and replaced with something raw and undisguised. "The court," he said, "has opinions about this. About whatever this is." The court had an opinion about it tonight as well, she said. Casimir called my devotion a weakness. Casimir is in the court's custody. His voice was low and precise, where he will remain, so his opinion doesn't count for much. No, a pause. The others, though, the court will watch. They will wait for you to become a liability. That is what the old blood does with anything it cannot categorize. It waits for proof that it was right to be suspicious. Then we'll give them no proof, she said simply. We'll give them the opposite. We did that tonight, didn't we? He looked at her, and she had the sense of something being decided in him, something that had been suspended on the edge of a decision for a very long time. Perhaps since a library ladder in this very house, perhaps since a covenant negotiation where she had catalogued Gerald's failures with precise, unimpressed accuracy. What we did tonight, he said slowly, establishes certain things. The court will interpret the covenant's invocation in the context of what they observed in that chamber. They will draw conclusions about the nature of the relationship between the Vale heiress and the Gravesend heir. What conclusions? She said, though she suspected she knew. That the relationship is not merely diplomatic, he said. That it is personal, that the devotion, as Casimir named it, runs in both directions. A pause. They will not be wrong, she breathed. The old house breathed around them, stone and years, and the quiet depth of everything that had happened here across 400 years. Vesper, she said. Isadora. If you are about to tell me that the nature of the relationship between the Vale heiress and the Gravesend heir creates complications for intercourt politics, I am aware of that. I have been aware of it for approximately 18 months. I have also been aware that the alternative, maintaining a formal distance when there is no formal distance in any meaningful sense between us, is a fiction that serves no one. I know, he said, and if you are about to tell me that a mortal and a vampire of your standing cannot, I am not going to tell you that, he said. I know very well what the interhouse restrictions on formal bonding say about mortal vampire pairings of standing. And I know equally well that the Vale Gravesend covenant creates specific exceptions to those restrictions. I have been aware of that for approximately 18 months as well. A pause. Longer, actually. She stared at him. You looked it up, she said. I have had considerable time this evening to reflect on the fact that I love you, he said, with the quality of a man delivering a legal brief, precise and measured, and that I have been avoiding saying so for reasons that seem, in retrospect, less substantial than they appeared at the time. The world reorganized itself slightly. That is, she said, after a moment, genuinely the least romantic delivery of those words in recorded history. I am aware, he said. And now the door was all the way open and the smile had arrived fully, and it was extraordinary. It changed the architecture of his face entirely, took the cold precision of it, and made it something warm and human and deeply, unexpectedly beautiful. I have 400 years of formal court training and almost no experience with this particular territory. I am apparently less prepared for it than I am for blood tribunals. That is deeply endearing, she said, and she was smiling too, and her hands had stopped shaking entirely. He reached up and took her face in his hands with a gentleness so careful it made her chest ache, his cold fingers against her warm jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone, and he looked at her with the full weight of 400 years of absolute attention, all of it on her, only her. I love you, he said again, and this time the delivery was nothing like a legal brief. It was quiet and certain and devastatingly sincere. I have loved you since the night you climbed my library ladder without permission and told me my organizational system was logically flawed. It is logically flawed, she said, her voice softer than she intended. It is, he agreed. I reorganized it 3 days after that night. I used your cross-referencing system. You? She laughed again, this time soundlessly, and his thumbs moved gently against her face. You never told me that. No. Why not? Because telling you would have required admitting that a 21-year-old mortal heiress had spent 40 minutes in my library and understood its structure better than I had in a century. My pride had some recovering to do. 400 years old and undone by a library ladder, she said, and tilted her face up and kissed him. He kissed her back with the same careful precision he brought to everything, and then the precision gave way to something else, something less calculated and more honest, and his hands moved from her face to her hair, and she felt him breathe her in. And the old house settled around them in the dark, like it had been waiting for exactly this moment for a very long time. The weeks after the tribunal were not simple. Nothing in the vampire world was simple, and nothing that touched the court of Nocturne ever resolved cleanly. But they moved through the complications with the same quality of attention they brought to everything else, which was to say thoroughly and without unnecessary alarm. The formal inquiry into Casimir Drav's violations took 6 weeks. Isadora testified twice before the tribunal's investigation panel, both times with the folio and both times with the polished, unflappable accuracy that had by now earned her a specific kind of grudging respect from the old blood lords and ladies who had initially dismissed her. She was not warm with them. She did not try to charm them. She simply knew everything relevant and said it clearly and left no opening for doubt or dismissal. And she watched them, one by one, revise whatever calculation they had been running on the subject of the Vale heiress. Vesper was present for both testimonies, seated to the left of the tribunal in the position reserved for the party with standing in the matter. He wore the formal court attire of the Gravesend heir, deep black, perfectly fitted, the silver sealer's line at his collar, and he watched Isadora with that full attention of his that the court by now stopped pretending not to notice. After the second testimony, one of the older lords, a vampire named Aldrich Soren, who had the distinction of being the only member of the tribunal who had abstained rather than voted for Vesper's conviction the night of Casimir's tribunal, fell into step beside Isadora in the corridor outside the chamber. "You were thorough," he said. "Thank you." It was not intended as a simple compliment. He paused. "The court has misjudged the nature of the Vale Gravesend alliance for some time. We treated it as a legacy arrangement, an old agreement maintained out of tradition rather than genuine mutual interest. That's a common mistake with old agreements," Isadora said. "People see the age and assume it means the relationship has calcified. They don't account for the possibility that some partnerships simply keep renewing themselves." Aldrich Soren looked at her with the amber patience of his 3 centuries. "The matriarch has asked me to convey something to you, informally. Formally would also be acceptable." "The matriarch prefers informal for things she doesn't want on record," he said. "She wants you to know that the court's position on mortal partners of vampire heirs is not entirely fixed. There is precedent, in the older records, for formal recognition of such partnerships and under specific covenant conditions." Isadora kept her face neutral. "That's interesting information. She thought you might find it so." He paused again. "She also wants you to know that what you did the night of the tribunal, not simply invoking the covenant, but the manner in which you did it, the preparation, the composure, the clear and evident understanding of blood law that most vampires in this court have never bothered to learn, changed the way the court sees you, and, by extension, the way the court sees its own assumptions. Its assumptions about mortal devotion being a weakness," Isadora said. "Yes." He inclined his head with the formal gravity of someone whose social training predated gunpowder. It would appear the court was wrong. Casimir Drav was formally stripped of his titles and territories 4 months after his arrest. It was the most significant act of court censure in living memory being a relative term in a room full of immortals, but significant regardless. His properties were redistributed under blood law, and 2 of them went, by right of the violations in his line, to Vesper Gravesend, the day the redistribution was formalized. Vesper came to find Isadora at the Vale family's London house, which was unusual. He typically preferred to meet on neutral ground or at the Gravesend residence. He had called ahead, which he always did, and she met him at the door and took one look at his face and pulled him inside without preamble. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing negative," he said. "The formalization went as expected." A pause. "Elspeth called me to her private chambers afterward, and she expressed her view with characteristic indirection that the Gravesend heir's continued conduct of his affairs, without a formally recognized partner of appropriate standing, was leaving the court's alliance structure incomplete." Isadora was still. She said that. She said it for approximately 20 minutes, with a great deal of historical precedent and intercourt treaty analysis. But yes, that was the substance. He looked at her steadily. She also said that the Vale Covenant's provisions for formal recognition of a mortal-vampire pairing had been reviewed by the court's legal counsel and were, quote, structurally sound. She's been doing her homework, Isadora said. We appear to have inspired something in the matriarch that might generously be described as pragmatic romanticism. He held her gaze. I want to be clear that this conversation is not a response to Elspeth's suggestion. I was going to have it regardless. I know, Isadora said. When were you going to have it? Tonight, he said. I have been, as you once observed, very slow about saying things. I have been working on that. She looked at him. This man who was 420 years old, and had survived court plots and blood tribunal, and the long grinding weight of immortal politics, and had looked at her, from the beginning, as if she were the most interesting and most important thing in any room they occupied together. This man who had reorganized his library using her system and sent her a message, designed her to make her come and save him, and been shaken to his foundations by watching her walk into danger on his behalf. This man who had told her he loved her with the cadence of a legal brief and kissed her in the dark of his old house like she was the thing worth holding on to at the end of everything. Ask me, she said. Will you accept formal recognition, he said, as the Gravesend heir's partner, under the Vale Covenant's provisions, with all that entails, the court politics, the blood law complications, the immortality differential, the fact that my world is old and cold and occasionally tries to murder its own members at tribunal. I am already in the middle of your world's court politics, she said. I have been most of my adult life. I happen to be quite good at them. You are extraordinary at them, he said, without any qualification. That is not the point. The point, she said, taking a step toward him, is that you want to know if I choose this knowingly. If I choose you knowing exactly what it means, yes, he said. Vesper, she said, looking up at him. I drove 4 hours in the middle of the night with a folio of blood law to walk into the most dangerous room I have ever been in, because the alternative was a world in which you were not in it. I think we established what I'm willing to do for this relationship. That was saving my life, he said. This is the rest of your life. I am aware of the difference, she said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached for her hands with both of his, and held them in that careful grip of his, cold and precise and unbearably tender, and looked at her with everything open, all the doors. I will protect you, he said quietly. Everything I have, every capability of this court, everything that 400 years had taught me about surviving. All of it is yours, for as long as you will have it. I know, she said. And I will continue to memorize blood law and invoke it when necessary and organize your library more efficiently than you can manage alone. That is, he said, the most reassuring offer of partnership I have ever received. You have received other offers of partnership? Several, he said, and his mouth curved. They were less compelling. She went up on her toes and kissed him, and he wrapped his arms around her with that particular quality of his, the one that was both deeply controlled and deeply genuine, the one that said she was safe and held and mattered with an eloquence that no amount of formal legal language could have matched. The formal recognition ceremony, as prescribed by the Vale Covenant's provisions, was small by court standards. Elspeth Vale presided, which was extraordinary. The matriarch did not typically attend recognition ceremonies, those being administrative rather than judicial matters. But she sat in her chair at the head of the court's private chambers with an expression that, in a woman of less architectural reserve, might have been called satisfied, and watched as Isadora Vale and Vesper Gravesend signed the covenant addendum before a gathering of the court's senior lords. Aldrich Soren served as witness, which he seemed to take as a particular honor. The thin woman from the tribunal, whose name Isadora had eventually learned was Mira Voss, brought flowers, which was so unexpected that Isadora had to work very hard not to laugh. Vesper stood beside Isadora at the signing table, and looked at her with that full attention that she had stopped trying to pretend did not affect her, and she looked back at him with everything she had. All the careful intelligence and the preparedness, and the devotion that the court had once called a weakness, and had since revised its opinion on considerably. When the addendum was signed and witnessed, and Elspeth Vale declared it formally recognized, the assembled court lords did something that surprised Isadora entirely. They applauded. Vampires were not, as a rule, demonstrative. Applause was not a common feature of blood law proceedings, but Aldrich started it, and the others followed with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and Miravos actually smiled. "They like you," Vesper said quietly, for her ears only. "They respect me," she corrected. "It's different. In this court," he said, "it is largely the same thing." A pause. "They are also, I suspect, relieved. The alliance with the Vale family has been this court's most stable, long-term agreement for 3 centuries. They know what it would have cost to lose it." "Is that what they're relieved about?" she said. "The alliance?" He looked at her, and the doors were open, all of them wide open. "No," he said softly. "The alliance has nothing to do with it. They watched me in chains in that chamber. They watched you walk in alone and free me. Even the oldest blood in this court understands what that means." "What does it mean?" "That you are not," he said, "the weakness. You never were. You were always the strongest thing in this room." He took her hand. "I was simply the last one to find a way to tell you." "You did tell me eventually," she said. "It only took a blood tribunal and a 4-hour drive. I said I was working on being less slow," he said. "I did not say I had completed the work." She laughed, and he watched her laugh with that expression she had no word for, the one that was entirely his and entirely for her. And the old stone chambers of the court of Nocturne held them both in the quiet and the cold and the accumulated history of every law and vow and alliance that had led them here. The months that followed the formal recognition were, by comparison to the tribunal and its aftermath, almost peaceful. Almost. The vampire world was never entirely peaceful, and the court of Nocturne in particular had the institutional habit of generating crises at regular intervals. But the crises had a different quality now. They were navigable. They were 2-person problems rather than solo ones, which made them, from Isadora's perspective, dramatically more manageable. The Casimir Drav network, it turned out, ran deeper than the initial investigation had revealed. He had subsidiaries, quiet arrangements, human interest groups on his payroll, the same groups he had framed Vesper for communicating with, and untangling those arrangements took the better part of a year. Isadora worked alongside the court's legal counsel on the untangling, which technically had no precedent for a mortal partner's involvement, but which Aldrich Soren's office handled by simply citing the covenant addendum as her basis for standing, a solution so elegantly simple that the court's legal team adopted it for all future reference, and she was good at it. She was frankly extraordinary at it, and she knew it without arrogance. In the way that she knew she was good at most things she chose to devote her full attention to. The vampire world's political structures were not so different from the human world's. At the fundamental level, they were still about power and alliance and the management of ancient grievances. But they had the added complexity of operating across centuries, which meant the grudges ran deeper and the documentation went further back, and the possible leverage points were dramatically more numerous. She found this, against all reasonable expectation, enjoyable. Vesper watched her work with the same quality of attention he had given her since the library ladder, and she had become by now comfortable enough in that attention to not feel the need to perform for it. She was simply herself, working, and he was simply himself, watching, and it was the most natural thing in the world. He had, in the months since the recognition, become measurably less formal with her. Not less controlled. He was constitutively incapable of the kind of unguarded casualness that came easily to people who had not spent 4 centuries in a court that treated any visible weakness as an invitation to strike. But the formality had shifted in quality. It was no longer the formality of careful diplomatic distance. It was the formality of a man who had very specific manners and used them as expressions of care rather than of reserve. He made sure she ate when she was deep in research and forgot. He learned, with the quiet attention of someone who had studied every detail of her preferences, that she took her tea with nothing in it and her coffee with too much milk, and that she functioned best before noon and worst between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. And he arranged the court's meeting schedules accordingly when it was within his power to do so. She learned him in return, with the same quality of attention. She learned that he had a particular dislike of the court's eastern wing, because the stone there had absorbed some quality of the building's worst historical periods, and it made him quiet in a different way from his usual quiet. She learned that he liked music that was very old, specifically early Baroque, and that he played it at low volume in the library when he was working on something that troubled him. She learned that for all his 4 centuries of immortal confidence and court-trained precision, he was still, at some essential level, a person who preferred the company of one trusted individual to any room full of people. She learned that she was that individual. On the first anniversary of the tribunal night, Vesper came to find her in the library, his library, which she had by now reorganized twice, and which he used with measurably greater efficiency and less suppressed frustration than before, and stood in the doorway, watching her read, with a quality of expression she recognized as the one preceding something significant. "You're about to say something you've been thinking about for a while," she said, without looking up from the manuscript she was reading, an 1801 correspondence regarding a previous iteration of the Casimir-Drav family's political maneuvering that she had found genuinely fascinating. "I have been thinking about it for 14 months, he said. She looked up then. He was in the doorway, and the library light, warm gold against the stone and the leather spines, caught the white of his hair and the pale, precise lines of his face, and she felt, as she had felt since almost the beginning, the quality of him in the room like a specific gravity. 14 months, she said. "Since the night I found you on the ladder," he said, "when I knew, clearly and without any ambiguity, what you were going to mean to my life." She set the manuscript down carefully. "You've known for 14 months and you're telling me now? I told you once that I have not rushed anything in a very long time," he said. "I am also, as you have noted, working on the slowness. This is, given my reference point, actually very fast." She considered this. "What were you thinking about for 14 months? He came into the room, and he stood before her chair, and he reached into the pocket of his jacket and produced something small. It was a ring, antique in the specific way of very old things that had been cared for with absolute attention across centuries, a dark stone set in silver metalwork of extraordinary intricacy. He held it in his palm, not offering it yet, simply showing her. "This was made in 1743, he said, the year the covenant was signed. The original agreement between the Vale family and the Gravesend line was formally, legally, a partnership of equals. The first Lord Vale and my ancestor both understood it as such. This ring was commissioned by my ancestor as a gift for the Vale Heiress of that generation, as a formal symbol of the partnership's equal standing." A pause. "She died before it could be given. It has been in the Gravesend vaults since then." Isadora looked at the ring. She looked at him. 300 years, she said softly. 300 years, he confirmed. "I have carried it since the night of the tribunal. I have been attempting to find the right words for 14 months. Have you found them?" "No," he said. "I suspect the right words for this don't exist, but the right person does." He looked at her with all the doors open, with everything, with 400 years of careful self-possession, and the one thing underneath it all that was none of those things. "I love you. I have loved you since a library ladder. I will love you for every year you allow me to, and I will spend those years making certain that you have standing and safety and a partner who knows the value of what you bring to every room you walk into. I would like, if you are willing, to make that arrangement permanent." She stood up from the chair and closed the distance between them and took the ring from his palm with steady hands. No shaking this time, not even slightly, and looked at it closely. The stone was dark red, deep as old wine, and the silver work around it was intricate as lacework, tiny figures that she recognized, after a moment, as symbols from the original covenant's illuminated text. She slid it onto her finger, and it fit with the particular fit of things that had been made to last. "Yes," she said, looking up at him with the full, uncalculated truth of it. "Absolutely yes." He exhaled, and the controlled quality of him relaxed in that specific way it only did with her, and he cupped her face in his hands the way he had on the night of the tribunal, cold and careful and unbearably tender. "Good," he said, and she heard in his voice the full weight of what it cost him to sound so simple about something that large. "Vesper." "Yes, for the record," she said, "your library system is still suboptimal in the northwest corner." He stared at her for half a second. Then he laughed. A real laugh, full and warm, extraordinary, in a man who had spent 4 centuries keeping everything measured, and pulled her close. and held her with that quality of his that said safe and held and mattered, and pressed his lips to the top of her head, and the library settled around them. All the old books and the old history and the 300 years of a ring finally given to the right hands. The second tribunal, 4 months after the engagement, was nothing like the first. There was no crisis, no blade at anyone's throat, no fabricated treason. It was, in the dry but significant language of blood law proceedings, a formal recognition of covenant amendment, which was the court's method of officially incorporating the Vale Gravesend partnership into its foundational legal record. Isadora prepared for it with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything. She read every precedent. She drafted 3 versions of the proposed amendment language and selected the one that was most legally bulletproof. She reviewed it with Aldrich Soren, who was becoming something genuinely close to a friend, in the particularly careful way that friendships formed between people separated by centuries and species. He made 2 suggestions, both good ones, and she incorporated them. She wore the Vale family's formal signing attire, dark grey silk, the silver key at her collar, and the ring, which caught the chamber's cold light, and made several court members look at it with varying degrees of curiosity and calculation, and something that, in the older ones, was closer to sentiment. Vesper stood beside her through the whole proceeding with the Gravesend heir's full formal bearing, white hair precisely back, the silver seal at his collar, that expression of absolute composed authority that she knew, now, concealed everything warm and genuine and hers. His hand found hers under the table at one point, when one of the court's newer members raised a procedural challenge that was technically valid but obviously intended as obstruction. His grip was calm and certain. She did not need the reassurance. She already had the counter-argument prepared, but she appreciated the solidarity, and she pressed back. She addressed the procedural challenge with 3 citations and a historical precedent from 1801 that the challenging member had clearly not considered. The challenge was withdrawn. Vesper's grip on her hand didn't loosen. Elspeth Vale received the amendment with the formal ceremony of her position, read it with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had presided over 3 centuries of such proceedings, and declared it recognized. The court applauded again. It was less surprising this time. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, Miravos intercepted them with the expression of someone delivering news they had been looking forward to delivering. "The matriarch has requested that you both join her for a private audience," Myra said. "This evening, if possible." They went. Elspeth's private chambers were in the deepest level of the court's underground residence, which was the tradition for the chambers of those who carried the most weight of history. The room was vast and cold, and lit by real candles in iron fixtures, an extravagance in the modern age that felt here simply correct. The matriarch sat in a chair that was not quite a throne, but was in the same general family, and she looked at Isadora and Vesper with those ancient, transparent temple eyes of hers that had seen everything and discarded nothing. "Sit," she said. They sat. "I have been watching," Elspeth said, "this court struggle with the concept of change for 300 years. The old blood is resistant to change by nature. Immortality encourages that resistance. When you live long enough, you see most things come and go, and the instinct becomes to hold very still and outlast whatever is currently disturbing the landscape." Neither Isadora nor Vesper spoke. When Elspeth Vale offered context, you listened. "What I saw in this court 6 months ago," Elspeth continued, "was something I have not seen in considerably longer than that. I saw a mortal walk into this chamber with 300 years of blood law at her command and dismantle, in real time, the most sophisticated internal conspiracy this court has produced in living memory, and I saw a vampire heir, chained and outnumbered and facing execution, hold absolutely still and trust the mortal to do it." A pause. "The court called it weakness," Elspeth said. "The court was wrong. What I saw was the oldest and most reliable source of strength that exists in any world, mortal or immortal." She looked at Isadora. "A partnership of equals. It is more difficult to find than any power or any law. When it exists, it is more durable than anything else in the human or vampire record." She paused. "I have not seen it in this court in a very long time. I find that I had forgotten its quality." Isadora looked at this ancient woman, who had ruled the most significant vampire court in existence for centuries, and felt, beneath the awe of that, something like recognition. "The First Lord Vale and the First Lord Gravesend," she said quietly, when they signed the covenant. Elspeth's expression did not change, but something moved in her eyes that was the very long echo of something very old. "Yes," she said. "What happened to them?" "They built something that lasted 300 years and produced you," Elspeth said. "I consider that a successful outcome." She looked at them both with the full weight of her authority and her age, and something else. Something quieter and more personal, something that was nearly, impossibly maternal. "Do not waste it. We have no intention of doing so," Vesper said. Elspeth nodded once. "Good," she said. "Then you are dismissed," and then, as they rose, "The ring suits you, child." Isadora looked down at the dark red stone on her hand, 300 years old, and finally where it was supposed to be. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." Elspeth made a gesture that was the most subtle dismissal Isadora had ever received. They left her to her candles and her centuries. In the corridor, Vesper was quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone processing something that had landed more deeply than they had anticipated. She called, "You child. She hasn't 1,000 years on me," Isadora said. "The math checks out." "She has never called anyone child in my 400 years of observing her interactions," he said. "Not once." Isadora thought about that for a moment. "I like her," she said simply. "She likes you," Vesper said, "which is historically unprecedented." A pause. "She is also not wrong about the ring. Your ancestor had good taste." "He had excellent taste," Vesper said. "I have excellent taste. It appears to be consistent across the generations." She laughed and took his arm, and they walked through the cold corridors of the court's underground residence. And the stone was old around them, and the air was still and deep, and it felt like something that had always been there waiting to be inhabited. Spring came late to London that year, the way it often did, arriving in fits and starts with sudden warmth between the cold. Isadora stood in the library. Their library now, she had taken to thinking of it that way, which Vesper had not objected to, and had, on 2 separate occasions, mentioned casually in conversation with court members, in a way that made it very clear he was not objecting. Standing on the rolling ladder she had originally climbed 2 years ago, shelving the last volume of a cross-reference system she had spent 3 evenings perfecting. "The northwest corner," Vesper said from the doorway, "is now entirely logical. It always had the capacity to be," she said. "It just needed the right attention." She climbed down and turned to find him standing in the room with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when he had just done something he found privately satisfying. He had a glass in each hand. One was wine, rich and dark. The other was a pale amber tea that she recognized as hers. "You made tea," she said. "I learned to," he said, bringing it to her. "It seemed practical. You consume an unreasonable quantity of it." "I consume a completely reasonable quantity," she said, accepting it, "given how much I work." "You work an unreasonable quantity of hours," he said, "for someone who is not the one technically responsible for running a vampire court." "I am technically responsible for the Covenant administration," she said, wrapping both hands around the warm glass, "which amounts to most of the interesting problems." "It does," he agreed. He stood beside her in the reorganized library and looked at the shelves with that quiet satisfaction he never quite managed to conceal. "Aldrich said today that the court's legal archive has never been as efficiently accessible as it has been since you took over the Covenant administrations. Aldrich is very polite, 8. Aldrich is, for a 300-year-old vampire, surprisingly bad at false praise," Vesper said. "When he says something is good, it is because it is good." He looked at her. "You change this court, Isadora, not simply in the political sense. The way the court operates, the way it thinks about its own laws and the relationships they govern. You changed it. You changed it," she said. "You were the one willing to trust a mortal enough to let her walk into that chamber. You were the one willing to walk in." "We've been over this," she said. "It was mutual." "It was mutual," he agreed. He lifted his glass slightly. "To mutual foolishness." She touched her tea glass to his wine. "To the strongest thing in any room," she said, using Elspeth's phrase. "Quiet and certain. Which is a partnership of equals." He looked at her with all the doors open and held the look for a long, full moment. Then he reached out and tucked a strand of her dark hair behind her ear with one careful finger, and the gesture was so simple and so entirely his that she felt it all the way down. "I love you," he said. The delivery by now was nothing like a legal brief. It had found its own cadence with repetition, warm and direct, and entirely without qualification. For the record, she said, "I love you. Even your original organizational system. I found it endearing in retrospect. That," he said, "is a revision of history." "I found it endearing while being genuinely frustrated by it," she amended. "Is that better?" "Marginally," he said, and smiled, the full smile that she had never gotten tired of seeing, that changed everything about his face. Outside, London was moving through its spring evening, traffic and lights, and the particular noise of a city that did not stop. Below it, the court of Nocturne was doing what it always did, managing its ancient politics and its blood laws, and its 4 centuries of accumulated alliances and grievances, now with somewhat better covenant documentation than it had previously enjoyed. In the spring streets above, no one knew the courts existed. No one knew that in a library inside a very ordinary-looking Georgian townhouse, a mortal heiress who had once climbed an unauthorized library ladder and pointed out a logical flaw was sitting on the edge of a reading table with a glass of tea and a ring that was 300 years old, talking to a vampire who had kept that ring in a vault for 14 months while he looked for the right words. No one knew. It didn't matter. What mattered was here, in the warm lamplight, in the organized shelves, in the full and open expression of the man sitting across from her, who had once been told that his devotion to a mortal was a weakness, and had trusted her anyway, who had put a blade's distance from death, and sent a message designed to save her while the chains bit into his wrists, who had spent 400 years in the cold of immortal politics, and had found, in a 21-year-old on a ladder, the one thing he had not thought to look for. I reached out and took his hand, and he closed his fingers around hers, and the library held them both, warm and quiet and permanent. All the books and the history and the 300 years of a covenant finally, completely understood. Some alliances were built on necessity, some on tradition. The best ones, the ones that lasted, the ones that produced something worth having, were built on trust and equal standing, and the particular kind of devotion that looked, to those who did not understand it, like a weakness, and was in fact the oldest and most durable power in any world. The court of Nocturne had learned that lesson at considerable cost. It would not forget it. Isadora Vale intended to make sure of that. She squeezed Vesper's hand, and he squeezed back, and outside the spring evening moved on. And above the court and the covenant, and the old stone chambers full of blood law and beautiful, impossible history, the city went on being alive. It was, she thought, exactly right.